The city lights of New York and the sprawling estates of the Hamptons twinkled like scattered diamonds, a breathtaking vista of wealth that should have inspired awe, but only served to illuminate the suffocating reality of Jasmine Everhart's life. At 45, she was a woman of undeniable substance, born into one of the East Coast's most enduring and esteemed black families, a lineage synonymous with philanthropy, old money, and impeccable breeding. Her existence, by all outward metrics, was an unbroken string of gilded successions, private schooling, European finishing, and a massive trust fund. Yet, she moved through this world not as its queen, but as a prisoner in a magnificent custom-built cage. The abundance surrounding her was a constant, mocking reminder of the one thing it could not buy: genuine human connection. The deep-seated grief of a life unlived, compounded by the sharp, persistent sting of societal cruelty, was the true inheritance she carried. Despite her innate grace, cultivated over decades in ballrooms and boardrooms, and a heart full of empathy that she often felt compelled to hide, Jasmine was known by a malicious moniker in her elite circle: the oversized heiress. It was a whisper that followed her from charity galas to exclusive country clubs, a cruel, concise dismissal of her worth based solely on her physical size, in a world that demanded a woman of her fortune also be rail thin. The judgment was ubiquitous, but its coldest source was in her own home. Her husband, David Vance, a man whose ambition was as sharp as his tailor's crease, used the term himself, cloaked in mock chivalry or veiled in domestic jabs. David was a shrewd and rapidly rising politician, a figure of charismatic public appeal, whose path to power was paved with other people's money and, most significantly, hers. He had married Jasmine a decade prior, and everyone, including Jasmine herself, knew the transaction was devoid of affection. It was a frigid contract, a merger of his political potential and her undeniable financial clout. Their marriage was loveless, defined entirely by his calculating indifference and her quiet suffering. David treated her not as a partner, but as an asset, a highly valuable if slightly inconvenient fixture necessary for his social and fiscal infrastructure. He performed his public duties as a devoted husband flawlessly, but behind the soundproof doors of their Hamptons mansion, his attitude was one of emotional withdrawal and intellectual dismissal. Jasmine had long accepted her role as the silent, enduring partner, believing that a life of stability, even a cold one, was better than a life of public scandal or outright loneliness. She existed in essence as the keeper of the family fortune, a title she was beginning to find indistinguishable from that of a highly paid, utterly miserable custodian. The only warmth she felt was the fleeting warmth of her own coat against the chill of her husband's constant, silent disapproval. On the eve of David's latest political triumph, a high-stakes fundraiser, celebrating his surging poll numbers, the air in the Vance mansion was thick with the scent of victory and expensive champagne. Jasmine, feeling particularly extraneous, retreated to the solace of the library, the only room in the house where she felt she could breathe. She was searching for a forgotten monograph when a low murmur from David's adjoining private study arrested her movement. She recognized the chilling voices immediately. David Vance and his mother, Priscilla. She hadn't intended to listen, but the phrase she caught first, "just a means to an end, mother, a very large end," froze the blood in her veins. She pressed her ear against the heavy oak door, and the subsequent words were a torrential downpour of icy malice. They were not merely discussing her wealth, they were discussing her existence. David spoke of her with a calculated detachment that turned her decade of silent endurance into a mockery. He referred to her as the Everhart Vault, temporarily accessible. Priscilla, with her signature dry aristocratic cruelty, contributed the finishing blow. Just ensure you secure the legacy before she manages to eat herself into an early grave. No loose ends, David. They were not just enduring her, They were callously discussing her as a financial vessel, openly revealing their plan to exploit her wealth until her eventual death. The devastation that hit Jasmine was swift and absolute, but it did not leave her broken. It left her resolute. The years of dull pain coalesced into a sharp, singular purpose. The contract was over. That very night, the refined, defeated Jasmine Everhart ceased to exist. In her place emerged a meticulous, cold architect of her own freedom. She did not rage. She acted. Drawing upon the financial acumen her father had insisted she master, she executed a flawless, surgical escape plan. She navigated complex international banking laws, transferring the bulk of her formidable fortune to a discreet Swiss account under a new, yet-to-be-used identity. Simultaneously, she initiated the sale of their sprawling Hamptons estate through a shell corporation, ensuring the transaction would take weeks to settle and trace. She was leaving no financial trail that led back to her. Her final act in that gilded prison was deceptively simple. On David's mahogany desk, next to a silver-framed photo of the two of them smiling a politician's smile, she placed a single handwritten note. It was brief and damning, a clean declaration of war. Thanks for making your true colors so vibrant. When she finally slipped out the servants' entrance, she took almost nothing. A worn backpack, a practical, nondescript coat, her passport, and one treasured relic, a small, faded photograph from her youth. In the photo, she was 19, smiling radiantly, her hair loose, her eyes full of unfulfilled dreams. It was a tangible symbol of the woman she was meant to be. Jasmine's journey ended not in another luxury hideaway, but in Eastgate, a battered, struggling neighborhood in Detroit. She chose it for its absolute antithesis to her former life. It was real, it was wounded, and most importantly, it was the last place anyone would look for the missing, oversized heiress. Here, the vastness of her wealth was irrelevant, her name unheard. She adopted the alias Lilaa Hayes, a name that sounded sturdy and unremarkable. In this community, battered by economic decline and systemic neglect, she found solace in anonymity. She rented a modest, sparsely furnished room above a local bakery, the smell of fresh bread a comforting constant. She made no grand pronouncements, told no compelling life story. She simply was. Lilaa Hayes was quiet, observant, and had an uncanny ability to organize and clean. She didn't seek to spend her wealth or flaunt her privilege. She sought immersion. She spent her days walking the streets, learning the rhythms of the residents' lives, their struggles, and their resilient spirit. She saw poverty not as a tragedy to be patronized, but as a condition that demanded engagement. The collective wounds of the community became a kind of unexpected mirror for her own personal, hidden pain and intending to the needs of Eastgate. She began tentatively to mend herself. The true epicenter of Lilaa Hayes' new existence was the Eastgate Community Health Clinic. It was a testament to grit and underfunding, housed in a repurposed brick building that was showing its age, but whose doors were perpetually open. It was a beacon of hope in a district where healthcare access was a luxury, and Lilaa, drawn by an instinct she hadn't felt in years, walked in and simply began to volunteer. She possessed no medical training, but she had a meticulous mind for logistics, a relentless work ethic, and a lifetime of managing large, complex households and fortunes. She immediately put these skills to use, organizing the chaotic supply room, streamlining patient intake forms, and orchestrating donation drives with quiet, effective precision. It was here she met Dr. Sam Miller. Sam was the clinic's dedicated physician, a man whose face carried the subtle, etched lines of chronic exhaustion and quiet compassion. He was perpetually overworked, running on coffee and a deep, seemingly inexhaustible commitment to his community. Sam was wary, not of Lilaa specifically, but of outsiders who showed up with bursts of enthusiasm only to fade away. He observed the new volunteer with a quiet intensity, Noticing how she didn't just file papers, she anticipated needs, tracking dwindling stocks of insulin and organizing prescription refills before they became crises. Sam carried his own quiet sorrow, a painful past that he guarded fiercely, choosing the grueling work in Eastgate as both a penance and a refuge. Yet, in Lilaa, he recognized a shared sense of profound internal displacement, a person who chose to work in the shadows rather than bask in the light. But it was Chloe, a spirited 9-year-old girl, who truly cemented Lilaa's anchor in Eastgate. Chloe was a frequent visitor to the clinic, bravely battling sickle cell anemia, a cruel, often invisible disease. She was small but fierce, possessing a pair of enormous, knowing brown eyes and a smile that could disarm a battalion. Lilaa first encountered Chloe during a particularly bad pain crisis. The girl was scared but resolute, clutching a worn copy of a fairy tale. Lilaa, instinctively kneeling down, spoke not of pain, but of the strength of the princesses in her book. From that moment, an unlikely and profound bond blossomed. Chloe didn't see the oversized heiress. She saw a steady, quiet woman who brought order to the clinic and listened without judgment. For Lilaa, Chloe was a tangible, immediate purpose. Her needs were simple, raw, and real, a stark contrast to the hollow, calculated demands of her former life. Lilaa would help manage Chloe's clinic visits, organize transportation, and most importantly, simply sit with her during her frequent treatments, reading or just holding her small hand. This relationship was transformative. In her marriage to David, Lilaa was an asset. With Chloe, she was essential. The pure, unconditional love she felt for the child, and the reciprocal, unadulterated affection she received, began to thaw the frozen landscape of her heart. She hadn't realized how desperately she craved a life defined by utility rather than luxury, by genuine feeling rather than financial transactions. Chloe became the living, breathing manifestation of Lilaa's decision to make her remaining time matter. The community began to embrace Lilaa Hayes fully. Leading the chorus of acceptance was Aunt Ruby, an elder whose wisdom was as vast as her network. Aunt Ruby ran the local soup kitchen and had a preternatural ability to read souls. She championed Lilaa, recognizing the depth of her contributions, her unpretentious manner, and the quiet dignity she brought to the clinic. Yet, even Aunt Ruby, with her discerning eye, and a few others in the neighborhood sensed that Lilaa's story didn't quite match the elegant clothes she occasionally still wore, or the perfectly modulated East Coast diction that sometimes slipped out when she was stressed. There was a profound, unspoken sorrow that clung to her, a sense that she was fleeing something vast, not just seeking something small. Lilaa's efforts at the clinic were a spiritual reclamation. She was rediscovering her innate strength, the same resilience that had allowed her to survive a loveless decade. She was turning her past pain into present productivity, channeling her formidable organizational skills into the service of others. The precarious peace she had built, however, was shattered one afternoon. Sam was on the phone in his tiny office, and the door was slightly ajar. Lilaa was restocking a shelf when she distinctly heard him utter a familiar, dreaded name into the receiver. Vance! The sound was a physical jolt. Her blood ran cold, her hands freezing on a box of syringes. The calm facade she had so carefully constructed threatened to crack, replaced by the immediate, paralyzing fear of being found. That single word dragged the gilded, terrifying shadow of her old life straight into the safe, healing light of Eastgate. Her anonymity, the very foundation of her freedom, now felt perilously fragile. The fear triggered by hearing the name Vance was a cold, constant companion. But instead of retreating, Lilaa Hayes, the woman formerly known as Jasmine Everhart, pressed forward. The fragility of her freedom only intensified her resolve to build something lasting. Her focus became the abandoned North End warehouse, a cavernous, forgotten space she envisioned transforming into the Lilaa Hayes Foundation. This wasn't just a shelter, it was to be a fortress, a sanctuary for abused women in Eastgate, powered by the residual capital she had strategically transferred. She poured her organizational genius into the blueprint, securing permits, consulting with local contractors, and meticulously planning the finances. It was a race against time, fueled by her desire to leave a tangible legacy. Meanwhile, David Vance was not idle. His public facade of the grieving husband was wearing thin under the pressure of his impending political campaign and the catastrophic disappearance of his primary financial pipeline. He had hired a team of expensive, ruthless private investigators, and the trail, once icy cold, was beginning to warm. The crucial break came from an unwitting source, a photo gallery posted online by the Eastgate Community Council. It was a collage of cheerful faces from a recent street fair, and tucked into the upper right corner, partially obscured but unmistakable to a calculating eye, was a glimpse of the oversized heiress. The shape, the particular set of her shoulders, and the coat she still wore. It was enough. David descended upon Eastgate not with the fanfare of a politician, but with the focused, cold intent of a predator, staking out his quarry. He moved through the neighborhood like an alien element, his polished shoes treading the worn asphalt, his presence a jarring, unwelcome note in the community's rhythm. Lena, receiving an immediate unspoken alert from Aunt Ruby about the suit-wearing trouble, was forced into a harrowing game of evasion. She felt the icy grip of her old life tightening, dodging side streets and moving her core operations strictly within the confines of the protective, watchful community. Simultaneously, Dr. Sam Miller's quiet suspicions had reached a boiling point. The accidental phone call, the instant, paralyzed fear he witnessed in Lena. It all fed into a growing internal conflict. He respected Lena Hayes immensely. He had seen her sacrifice, her tireless compassion, and the life-saving purpose she brought to Chloe in the clinic. Yet the pieces didn't fit. The polished accent, the almost innate understanding of high finance, and the sudden meticulous disappearance of a large, wealthy woman with uncanny resemblance to his volunteer. Digging into his own buried past, Sam used an old contact in the city records department. He cross-referenced the vague facial recognition from the fair photo with missing persons reports, and the truth hit him with the force of a physical blow. Lena Hayes was Savannah Rhodes, the missing wife of David Vance. But the discovery was compounded by a searing personal connection. David Vance was the political opportunist who had, years ago, ruthlessly fired Sam from a prestigious hospital. Sam had refused to cover up Vance's involvement in an illegal prescription kickback scheme that was meant to enrich the politician and a pharmaceutical backer. The confrontation had cost Sam his career, his reputation, and his emotional equilibrium, forcing him to Eastgate. Now, the woman he had come to admire was inextricably linked to the man he despised. He found Lena alone in the clinic's back office, reviewing construction bids for the foundation. His voice was low, taut with conflicted emotion. "Lena," he started, placing a sheaf of printouts on the desk, the missing person file clearly visible. "I know who you are. You're Jasmine Everhart." The moment of truth wasn't a sudden explosion, but a weary exhale. Lena looked at the printout, then at the man whose respect she had desperately wanted to keep. She didn't deny it. She admitted to the identity, the abusive marriage, the betrayal, and the theft of her own fortune, the necessity of her escape. But as the final explanation, she added a truth darker and more profound than her financial flight. Her eyes met Sam's, now swimming with a profound sorrow. "I didn't just leave David because he hated me, Sam," she confessed, her voice barely a whisper. "I left because I was given a timeline. It wasn't just my freedom I was running toward. It was the need to make my last months count." She revealed her terminal diagnosis: lupus with severe organ involvement. The disease had progressed to a point where the prognosis was non-negotiable. She hadn't run to save her life. She had run to save her death, to ensure her final chapter was one of purpose, love, and self-determination, not the cold, calculated exploitation of the Vance family. The money was not just a tool for her freedom. It was the capital for her final great act of redemption. This was the crushing, agonizing weight that explained her feverish work ethic, her quiet despair, and her desperate need to build the foundation before her time ran out. You're absolutely right. Now that the core conflict and the central secret have been revealed, expanding the narrative to fully explore the emotional fallout and escalating tension is entirely possible and beneficial for the story. The air in the clinic office grew heavy with the weight of Lena's confession. Dr. Sam Miller, who had braced himself for evasion or denial, was instead hit with the raw, terminal truth. He didn't see the calculating heiress. He saw a woman stripped bare by betrayal and facing a premature deadline. The lupus, the organ failure. The details explained the urgency, the fierce dedication, and the profound sadness he had sensed from the moment she walked into Eastgate. "You ran to build a foundation," Sam whispered, the initial anger over her deception dissolving into a deep, painful empathy. "You knew you didn't have much time left." Lena nodded, her composure fragile but intact. "I had spent 10 years existing as an ornamental bank account. I wouldn't spend my last year dying as David's collateral damage. I needed to be Lena Hayes for as long as I could. I needed to be Chloe's friend. I needed my money to do something real." The secret was out, and with it came a strange, weary relief. For the first time in months, she was truly honest with another soul. Sam, looking at her, understood that his initial urge to expose her had vanished. His professional loyalty was now to his patient, and his human loyalty was to the woman who was fighting to define her own end. The revelation of Lena's identity and her illness was immediately overshadowed by a confession, far darker and more deeply rooted in the Vance family's history. Priscilla Vance, David's formidable mother, whose icy demeanor usually precluded any genuine emotion, sought out Sam, driven by an uncharacteristic mix of guilt and sheer panic. She could see her son's carefully constructed world imploding, and in her fear, a lifetime of secrets began to unravel. Meeting Sam in a neutral, upscale cafe miles from Eastgate, Priscilla's voice was a barely controlled tremor. "My son is a monster, doctor, and I made him," she began, her polished exterior cracking to reveal a lifetime of suppressed trauma. The shocking truth she revealed was that David Vance was not her biological child, at least not in the way the world believed. He was the product of a brutal assault she had endured decades ago, a horrific event she had buried under layers of wealth and societal expectation. She had raised David as the heir her husband demanded, masking the painful truth with fierce, controlling ambition. "I taught him to be cold, to be untouchable," she admitted, tears finally glistening in her eyes, "to ensure no one could ever wound him the way I was wounded. But I only created a different kind of monster." Her confession then twisted into something deeply unsettling. Priscilla revealed that the man who had assaulted her had a distinct physical mark, a rare birthmark on his left shoulder, and that the date of the assault and the resulting pregnancy aligned eerily with Chloe's age. "I know this sounds insane, doctor," she urged, her hands trembling, "but I've seen the birthmark on Chloe during her hospital stays. I've heard her mention an estranged father who was volatile. I fear Chloe might be connected to that man, to my assaulter." Priscilla's words hung in the air, connecting the seemingly disparate lives of the wealthy elite and the struggling community clinic. The drama was no longer just about financial betrayal. It had metastasized into a tragedy rooted in generational trauma and violence, suddenly tethering David's dark origin to the fate of the little girl Lena loved. Sam was stunned into silence, realizing that Eastgate was not merely Lena's refuge, but potentially the nexus point for an entire family's horrific legacy. For Lena, the intensifying drama of the outside world was strangely insulating, confronted with her own mortality and the escalating risks of discovery, she focused intently on the present. The lupus, manifesting as relentless fatigue and periods of sharp pain, was a constant reminder of her fleeting time, but it also sharpened her focus. It was during a particularly bad day, curled up on her small bed, that she discovered a sealed envelope tucked inside an old family photo album. A letter addressed to her, penned years ago by her late mother. Lilaa hesitated, knowing the emotional weight of anything her mother, a woman perpetually constrained by her class, might have written. When she finally opened it, the contents were a cathartic shock. Her mother's confession wasn't cold or critical. It was filled with deep, wrenching regret. She confessed to seeing the coldness in David Vance, to understanding the misery he was inflicting, and to failing to intervene. "I was a coward, my beautiful girl." The letter read, "I was terrified of the public disapproval, of the scandal of leaving him, and I sacrificed your happiness for my own comfort and standing. Forgive me for not protecting you from Marcus." This final honest reckoning from the woman whose approval she had silently sought for decades was the emotional linchpin Lilaa needed. It wasn't forgiveness she sought, but validation. Her mother's words freed Lilaa from the internalized burden of having to be the perfect, enduring trophy wife. She wasn't just justified in leaving. She had been owed a rescue. With the emotional slate wiped clean by her mother's posthumous words, and her purpose vividly defined by her work in South Shore, Lilaa shed the last vestiges of Jasmine Everhart. She could now fully concentrate on her final, magnificent endeavor, building the Maya Solar Foundation. Her life was no longer about surviving David's cruelty or appeasing her mother's expectations. It was about the tangible reality of the shelter, the hope it represented, and the future she was creating for women she would never meet. She was finally living a life that transcended her own pain, making her short remaining time the most significant chapter of all. The final months of Lilaa Hayes' life were a furious, magnificent burst of creation, driven by the relentless ticking of her biological clock and the emotional freedom granted by her mother's letter. She oversaw the transformation of the dilapidated North End warehouse. The structure, once an eyesore, was reborn as the Lilaa Hayes Foundation. Its opening was not a grand society affair, but a deeply moving community celebration. The building, funded by the last substantial portion of Jasmine Everhart's remaining wealth, stood as a defiant, beautifully tangible symbol of purpose over pain, and its existence instantly became a beacon of hope for the women of Eastgate. Lilaa, though growing visibly frailer, stood at the entrance, leaning lightly on Dr. Sam Miller, her face alight with an exhausted but profound joy. The foundation was open, its purpose secured, and her mission was complete. The community, led by the proud Aunt Ruby, cheered, celebrating not the heiress, but the woman who had given them sanctuary. The foundation's opening acted like a magnet, drawing the final unresolved threads of Lilaa's old life to Eastgate. The first to appear, humbled and bearing gifts not of wealth but of genuine concern, was Priscilla Vance, David's mother. Having revealed her darkest secret to Sam, Priscilla was no longer the icy society matriarch, but a woman seeking to atone for a lifetime of complicity. She first visited Chloe, the young girl whose connection to her own traumatic past was still an agonizing suspicion. Priscilla sat by Chloe's bedside, her eyes wide with a fragile tenderness that was foreign to her character. She didn't speak of the past, only of the future, offering quiet encouragement and a solemn promise to help. Days later, Priscilla approached Lilaa at the foundation, asking for a private moment. Standing in the very shelter Lilaa had built, Priscilla laid bare her soul. She confessed to her own failure, her role in raising David to be a cold, calculating opportunist, her silence regarding his abuses, and her initial glee at his access to Lilaa's fortune. "I allowed my own suffering to make me cruel to you, Lilaa," she admitted, her voice thick with genuine shame. "I ask for your forgiveness for the part I played in his wickedness." Lilaa looked at the once indomitable woman, seeing only the scared, traumatized mother beneath the polished facade. Her response was measured, profound, and utterly final. "I forgive the suffering that made you weak, Priscilla," she said softly, touching the older woman's hand. "But I cannot forgive the actions you took against me. Redemption is yours to earn, not mine to grant. You must find your own way to honor the truth." The encounter was closure, offering compassion without absolving the past. The second visitor was the one Lilaa had been dreading and simultaneously anticipating: David Vance. His appearance was not penitent but predatory. He was now engulfed in a rapidly escalating corruption scandal, and the pressure was immense. The sale of the Hamptons mansion had finally closed, putting a final traceable amount of money out of his grasp, and the legal walls were closing in. He cornered Lilaa in an unfinished wing of the foundation, his voice low and dangerous, stripped of all public charm. "You ruined me, Jasmine," he hissed, using her old name like a weapon. "But we can fix this. I've tracked the account. Come back. Make a statement that you left by choice, that you were ill and confused. I'll get you the best care. You save my career and I'll keep your foundation running as a memorial to my generous wife." It was a final desperate attempt to trade on her compassion and control her narrative. Lilaa faced him, her body frail but her spirit ironclad. She saw not her husband but a hollow husk consumed by ambition. Her rejection was swift and absolute. "You have nothing left to offer me, David," she stated, her voice clear and steady. "I have no reputation to protect, and my legacy is already here, under my own name." She did not wait for his answer. Instead, she reached into her pocket and handed him a sealed, thick envelope. It contained a comprehensive, meticulously written letter. Not a rant, but a cold, final condemnation of his life, his cruelty, and his empty pursuit of power. The letter declared their connection irrevocably severed, legally and morally, laying bare his true, calculated nature. She was not just divorcing him, she was dismissing his entire existence. David was left standing alone, clutching the letter, as Lilaa walked away, leaning on Sam. The sight of her, free and purposeful, was the final confirmation of his utter collapse. His empire of lies, built on her wealth and his ambition, had finally imploded. Lilaa's health rapidly declined in the weeks following the confrontation. She had poured every last ounce of her energy into the foundation and the rejection of David. Her time was now solely dedicated to quiet moments with Sam, who cared for her with a tender, focused devotion, and with Chloe, sharing stories and laughter, cold morning. Sam entered her small room above the bakery and found her. Lilaa had passed away peacefully in her sleep, a faint, serene smile on her lips. It was a quiet, self-determined end, entirely on her own terms. She had left behind a trove of carefully sealed letters, one for Sam, one for Chloe, one for Aunt Ruby, and even one for Priscilla. Each contained a personal message of gratitude, love, and a clear directive for the future of the foundation, entrusting her vision to the Eastgate community that had given her purpose. But the final piece of her legacy was the manuscript hidden beneath her mattress. It was a searingly honest account of her life, simply titled, "My husband said I disgusted him." It was discovered by Chloe and, at the child's insistence, published by Sam. The book was an immediate sensation, a viral success that resonated with women globally, inspiring them to reject judgment and reclaim their own narratives. Its vast proceeds ensured the permanent expansion of the foundation, forever cementing Lilaa's legacy. Chloe, now recovering and thriving, channeled her own pain and newfound purpose into writing a children's book inspired by Lilaa's bravery. Priscilla, seeking deep, anonymous redemption, quietly donated her entire considerable fortune to the foundation, becoming a dedicated, silent volunteer. David Vance vanished into the political and legal obscurity he deserved, his ambition dissolving into scandal and ruin. A year later, a ceremony was held at the magnificent, expanded Lena Hayes Foundation. Women from all walks of life, from the Eastgate neighborhood to visiting figures, shared how Lena's story had empowered them to find their own voices and leave their own prisons. Sam and Chloe, standing together as the new guardians of the foundation, carried forward her vision, a tangible truth that proved love, authenticity, and self-determination were the most powerful forms of wealth, outlasting even the deepest of betrayals. The relentless, feverish pace of Lena Hayes' final months gave way to a profound, quiet serenity. Having completed her great work and confronted her betrayer, she was free. Her days were now a collection of small, precious moments. Watching the morning light filter through the window, listening to Chloe read aloud, and accepting the tender, focused care of Dr. Sam Miller. Sam, having initially been her reluctant adversary, was now her fiercely loyal companion and caregiver, his devotion a quiet balm against the final approach of her illness. The bond they forged in the face of death was one of profound, unspoken love and mutual respect. One crisp, clear morning, the silence in the small room above the bakery felt different. Sam entered expecting to offer Lena her morning medication, but instead found her still. Lena had passed away peacefully in her sleep. There was no struggle, no pain etched on her face, only a faint, utterly serene smile that suggested a soul that had finally found its rest and its truth. Her death was the final defiant act of a life reclaimed, a quiet departure entirely on her own terms, free from the judgment and calculation of her past. In the small drawers of her dresser, Sam found the trove of carefully prepared envelopes. Each one was addressed in her elegant, distinctive script for Sam. A letter filled with gratitude, a confession of love, and a detailed will entrusting him with the financial and operational oversight of the foundation. She urged him to continue his healing work and promised that in serving Eastgate, he would continue to find peace from his own past. For Chloe, a letter full of hope and unconditional love, encouraging her to use her voice and her story to inspire others, along with a special trust fund to ensure her health and education were secure. For Aunt Ruby, a note of deep respect, entrusting her with the preservation of the foundation's spirit and its integration with the community. For Priscilla Vance, a brief, final message of acknowledgement. It was neither accusatory nor forgiving, simply recognizing the shared pain of womanhood and suggesting that true atonement would be found in selfless action. Lena's final will was unambiguous. The Lena Hayes Foundation and the bulk of her remaining assets were to be governed by a board led by Sam, Aunt Ruby, and a designated financial manager, ensuring that her legacy remained permanently rooted in Eastgate. The story we have told is fictional, but is based on some real events. The names and places have been changed to protect the identity of those involved. We're not sharing this to pass judgment, but in the hope that someone listens and pauses to think. How many mothers are suffering in silence inside their own homes? I'm so curious. If you were in my place, what would you do? Would you choose to stay silent to keep the peace? Or would you dare to face it all to get your voice back? I want to know what you think, because every story is a candle that can light the way for someone else. God always blesses.